Welcome back, everybody, to Sibos TV. You're watching our lunchtime report. Right now, we're going to talk all about the future of standards, and joining us to discuss this are Yves Bonton. He is the head of standards for R&D at Swift. Ineke Bousamaker, she is the executive vice president at Rabobank. Manu Sporny is with us as well, chair of the Web Payment Standards World Wide Web Consortium, and Hans Tesselar is the executive director of the Banking Industry Architecture Network. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. Let me kick off with you, Yves, first of all. The future of standards, really big topic there. What should the focus be on?
Well, the focus is essentially on understanding the impact that the recent changes in the banking environment will have on the forthcoming 5 years. So we've identified a few typical changes, I would say. The first one is we've seen really a big rise of globalization. So some banks now act really on a global level, but at the same time, some banks are also acting on a very domestic level. So we see these two. We see a kind of divide.
Conflicts.
Yes, there is a conflict. There's a kind of divide. And there is definitely a call for harmonization. So every country is developing its own, let's say, market practice or its own usage guideline for its own region. But banks that operate globally have definitely a need to understand what the differences between the two different regions are, and the standardization body in the future will have to take this into account to better harmonize the different regions. There are initiatives like the CGI initiative, for example, that try to do that typically. A second thing we've seen is a change in the technology around standards. Let's say 20 years ago, the only way to exchange information between banks was by sending messages to each other. Today, it's not the case anymore. If you think of Twitter, you can now easily send millions of messages, but those messages are very short. So the information you can put in them is actually very short, and in order to put a lot of information, you need to store it somewhere else in the cloud and reference it in your Twitter, in your tweet. And we think that this kind of analogy could just be applied to banking as well. When you make a payment, you could just store your payment transaction somewhere, and then as it flows around across the borders, this payment transaction could be augmented by the various stakeholders. That's so typically one of the change that could change the way we do collaboration in the banking business. The third thing definitely is regulation. We see a big rise in regulation post-crisis, and we think that taking the regulators into account, or taking at least the regulators' requirements in terms of information into account in the standardization process is key. So typically, banking standards were always about two parties. But now there's a third party in the middle that needs to be informed, that needs to be notified of things that happen. And taking those requirements into account can make a big change to simply facilitate compliance with regulation.
Okay, and Ineke, you're sitting at the bank level, if you like, and we're just going to pick up on regulation because we were chatting a little bit earlier in the break, and you were saying that that could actually, if it happens too early, or if it happens too much, it's going to kill innovation.
That's what I believe. I mean, my example would be in the European context, where we're building a pan-European payment infrastructure, SEPA, where the next step of SEPA could be looking at internet payments and mobile payments across Europe. And what we see is an intention by the European regulators to regulate the standardization of e-payments and m-payments. And I firmly believe that because they're still quite in an innovation stage, and as you mentioned, very different stages across different countries in Europe, innovation starts small. Innovation starts with small pilots, regional pilots, local pilots, and then when successful, they grow. If you regulate standardization too early in that whole process, I believe you kill innovation.
Right. And we're seeing quite a bit of this happen, kind of play out in the US now. We've got all these Bitcoin startups that have looked at creating these really interesting new business models, new payment technologies. And what we're seeing is that the US regulation for money transmission laws have put a lot of these companies out of business. They kind of popped up overnight and they were gone just as quickly because of the strong amount of regulation there is with respect to money transmission laws in the US.
Is that your view as well, Hans?
Well, my view is that the regulator, they have a role to play, but the regulator is, I think, this moment then too much detached of the, let's say, the real business. So if we can get them closer and standards could help them to understand what we are doing, if we're talking the same language, then the regulator will also understand what the impact of all the regulatory issues are, and that will then speed up the whole of the process.
Give me some of the areas, Hans, where you think that they need to understand a little bit more about the real business that they're dealing in. Give me some examples of what you mean.
Well, from my perspective, from an IT perspective, so that's not from a banking perspective, we see that the regulator, they have EDP auditors, and they look at the portfolios and the projects and programs, and are they contributing, are they not jeopardizing, let's say, the continuity of the organization. But for instance, they don't have, let's say, EDP architects. People who can overlook the whole of the landscape, look at the weak spot, look at the strong spot, see where to move to. So if they also mature in that perspective, then they are more on a level playing field with the banks, and then we can help each other, and then we move forward as a team instead of two separate entities.
Any of you want to pick up on that?
And a large part of this, I think, is about communication between all of these organizations. There has to be a lot of really good communication between SWIFT, the banks, technology organizations such as Google, PayPal, people that want to get interested or at least work on payment technologies need to speak with one another and just understand what the pain points are, understand what problems need to be solved in general, and then move towards a common goal. If we don't have a broad set of communications across these industries, across industry partners and the standardization bodies and the regulators, we can see a lot of churn in the future, and we don't want that. We want a smooth path forward.
I'd like to add actually one other stakeholder, which is the customer or the user. In the payments industry, we see that we have been standardizing among banks, between banks and clearing and settlement organizations. And the customers have said, on the one hand, yes, we want you to standardize because it will make it easier for us as the customer. On the other hand, we have organized the standardization process sometimes in a way very siloed, leaving out the impact of what we're doing on the customer. And I've had lots of complaints from customers saying, yes, we've asked you to standardize, but by the way, not in this way. And I think the customer is a stakeholder.
What do they want?
Well, they want two things. They want one, standardized, and they want also flexibility. And then when you build flexibility in the standards, they say, well, you've built too much options into your standards. So I think ultimately the way to go forward is the dialogue, and not just between the standardization bodies and the banks in payments, but also, if and when appropriate, don't make it too big, the end user and customer.
Variability in standards is something that is just natural. I mean, we tend to define standards at a global level. It must apply to everyone. So standards are naturally big.
And therefore, then you create too many options.
And then we create too many
and
options.
then the end user says, yeah, there is a standard, but with too many options. So which part of the standards applies to me?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest examples, not from standardization, but what the consumer wants, is the remote control. If you go to the remote control of a video recorder, DVD player, there are so many options because it was invented by an engineer who wants to offer you all those options. And if you go to the remote control that you get with your Apple TV, there's only one button.
You press.
And it's the user.
And it's the user interface that makes it happen. So all the functionalities are there, but you don't have to show them all and confuse people with 100 buttons and shift and so on. And so I think the remote control is an example of standardization, but over standardization, giving all the options to people who not want all the options.
People have,
well, I mean, I think that's absolutely a vital point, that the customer should be the person that's placed first in this area. And we look at a lot of this customer-centric design at the World Wide Web Consortium. So we've got 2.4 billion people that are using the web today. Right? That's a huge customer base. And payments for them is very difficult these days. If you think about a standard payment, you go to a website, you have to sign up for an account, you have to type in your credit card number, you have to type in your shipping address, and that's just a very customer experience. It's a non-experience for them. So we have to figure out ways of smoothing that experience for the person that's making the purchase or wanting to do any kind of value exchange on the web. And I think that's where the World Wide Web Consortium is coming in and trying to work with the established payments companies like Google Wallet, PayPal, Firefox, Mozilla Firefox is coming out with a new payment standard now, and what we're trying to do is make it easier for people on the web to just transact with one another. They ultimately they don't really care, what the financial institution that's backing that transaction is. They just want to buy something.
You touch upon something which is very important, which it has to be very easy in terms of user experience, but it has to be very safe and secure. And I think a lot of that is a trade-off between ease of use and how safe and secure, because at the same time the consumer wants safety and security in their payment. So they want it to be easy, but also safe and secure.
Because we're difficult customers, aren't we? We want everything. You were going to come back on a few things.
Yes, I wanted to come back on the example of the video remote controller. Actually, what we've seen is that it's just a fact of life. Those standards are global, and they used to be documented by just providing a tenth of different documents describing the different ways where you have to use them and so on. So the move we made when we've built My Standards platform, for example, was to actually standardize the way you represent the deviations of the variations on the standard. So it was like standardizing on another level, if you want. So instead of everyone sending out an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document describing, here's how you should use my standard, we said, okay, you want to explain how to use your standard, here's a standard to do it.
Okay, and sorry, you were going to say something? You wanted to?
Oh, well, it was mostly kind of going back to the idea of making sure that these systems are secure. And I think that's an absolutely fantastic point. Right? When someone goes to spend money, especially on the web, they want to make sure that that transaction is secure, right? And if you think about transactions on the web today, there are multiple places where they're completely not secure. So the idea that you go to a website that you've never been to before, and you give them your credit card number, which is effectively a password right into your bank account, and they have no limitation on how much money they can spend, when they with that number, that's kind of an example of a security issue that we can address today. So it's those kinds of issues that we're looking at the W3C. How do we address those sorts of security issues and make just purchasing things on the web easier?
When we didn't do our payments on the web, we gave our credit card to the waiter. He disappeared somewhere in the whatever backyard of his restaurant, and then we hope that he will deduct $40 of our. So we did the same in the old days.
Right.
There's a difference, though.
Yeah, there is a difference. I know there is a difference, but that's what we used to. So I think the most of the consumers are not aware of the risk. They assume everything is safe. They assume everything goes, and I think it's up to us, the financial industry, to make sure that it's safe and secure and so on and so forth. So that's a huge task, and then I agree. There's always, is it easy or is it safe, and what is the trade-off between both? And that's something that the juggle that we have to make.
And in some cases there isn't a trade-off,
Sorry.
Right, and that is really the fight with standards, as you were saying. It's a balancing act. In some cases there isn't a trade-off. In most cases, though, there is.
Okay. Final comments then. Your views so far on what you've heard related to your topics at the conference, and what do you think is not on the agenda yet that we should be putting on the agenda? You're at Swift, so that's putting you on the spot. Yes. Let's start with Ineke then.
In terms of standards and the future of standards, I think actually a lot is on the agenda, and maybe we should look back after this conference and say what wasn't for next year's conference. So I'll leave it at that.
I think next generation technologies like Bitcoin and Ripple and Payswarm, things that are really nascent right now, but could be potentially really disruptive. For example, a lot of these standards are decentralized, meaning that there's no need to have a central clearinghouse for payments using these technologies. So what does that mean for the future of banks? What does it mean for the future of Swift?
Tell us about Ripple and
Ripple is a way of doing kind of an IOU network, only it's at the global scale. So the idea here is that you can lend someone money to someone in India, and the payment happens immediately. It doesn't have to go through any kind of banks. It ripples through the internet. The same thing with Bitcoin. It's like cash with wings. If you want to send money to someone on the other side of the world, you just type in an address, just like sending an email. You hit send, and within 10 minutes they have the money. So that's potentially disruptive for the world remittance, for sending money across the web, so especially for the banking institutions that kind of do that as a core practice now.
And Hans, for you, what should be on the agenda?
Well, I think what should be on the agenda is that we should see at least standards as an enabler of growth and an enabler of innovation instead of a hurdle. So now we have standards to do standards, because the standards is so complex. That already explains that it's very difficult to make something nice out of it. So if we take a more outside-in view on standards and then move forward from that one, and keeping all the good things we have in place, I think that could be a great topic for our next conference.
Okay, well guys, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you all with us.